sounds like you're making a case for is that what one academian says that might ruffle some feathers really pales in comparison to actual policy and awareness.
Well, not only does it pale, but don't forget in this case, it has consequences for policy. I mean, if in fact we were defending South Vietnam, that makes it legitimate for us, and it was used that way, to defend Nicaragua by sending a terrorist mercenary force to practically wipe the country out. And it makes it legitimate for us to have armed and trained the elite battalions that carried out that assassination, and on and on. So this goes well beyond a comment. This is an overwhelming mass of doctrine which has direct consequences, human consequences on a vast scale. So it's incomparably more important than whatever it is that Ward Churchill may have said.
It's interesting you brought up the subject of Nicaragua, because I did read and actually listen to some of your audio books on the subject of something that could not be more obvious in terms of the U.S. not following the World Criminal Court or UN Court,
National Court of Justice.
And
the U.S. now has the honor of being the only country to have rejected a World Court decision. Before, up till recently, it had some company, Enver Hoxha's Albania. But with the overcoming of that ultra-Stalinist dictatorship, the U.S. now stands alone. This is something that ought to be taught in elementary school, just as what's there ought to be taught. If it's concealed, that's serious deception. Not only scholarly fraud and journalistic fraud, but with enormous policy consequences.
Now, Ward Churchill has repeatedly said, and at speaking engagements, in terms of what he suggests the U.S. is to do. And the U.S., he just basically says, follow the law, follow international law, and then infers that then the Middle East terrorists will leave you alone, they won't be bombs. Based on that, do you think that would be realistic, that if the U.S. did decide now to follow international law in terms of the World Criminal Court, World Court, things would change in terms of?
Here there happens to be good scholarship, and it generally conforms to his view. In fact, even government documents do. So if you go back to I don't think it would be perfect. I mean, they've probably never heard of Nicaragua in the Middle East. But there is, let's take a look at the record that we have. In 1958, and any scholar interested in the Middle East or journalist interested in the Middle East should know this. In 1958, President Eisenhower asked his staff why there is what he called a campaign of hatred against us among the people of the Middle East, not the government, but the people. Well, the National Security Council, highest planning body, had given an analysis of this, and it said the reason for the campaign of hatred against us is that the people of the Middle East consider that we act to oppose democracy and development and support brutal and despotic regimes, and that we do so because we want to maintain control over their energy resources. And then it went on to say, it's sort of correct, so it's understandable why they think that. Well, that was 1958. Okay, after 9/11, so it continues. Let's go to after 9/11. After 9/11, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, was, I think, the only newspaper to have tried to do a survey of opinion in the Middle East. I mean, they kept to the kind of people they were interested in, what they called moneyed Muslims, like bank managers, heads of transnational corporations, lawyers, and so on. People right in the middle of the U.S.-run globalization project, so no questions about that, and wealthy and so on. Found the same thing. This is a campaign of hatred against us based on exactly the same reasons, now with new ones. The new ones were support for Israeli atrocities and the sanctions against Iraq. Now, they hated Saddam Hussein, but they knew what we're not supposed to know, that the sanctions were killing hundreds of thousands of people, that they were destroying the society, they were strengthening the tyrant, and probably keeping him in power, because the population was dependent on him for survival. And that causes a campaign of hatred. Well, now, if we were to change policy, would that go? Probably. In fact, the Pentagon agrees. So, for example, Paul Wolfowitz explained one of the reasons for invading Iraq was to be able to move military bases out of Saudi Arabia. And he said, yeah, it's true, our bases in Saudi Arabia are what inflame groups like Al-Qaeda. They regard that as an invasion of the most holy land, so fine, we'll move them somewhere else. So he agrees. So what's the debate?
What Ward Churchill also did mention in regards to Iraq was it was the sanctions taking place during the 90s, which Madeleine Albright, whether even though she's backtracked on that in terms of her statements, the figure that Ward Churchill uses is 500,000 plus Iraqi children.
That's what she agreed to.
Yeah,
and she said the price is worth it.
Since then, even though she did make some statements saying that on Democracy Now! That she did not make the decision she was talking about, but regardless of what the facts were.
That's why I didn't mention her. Everyone agrees that the toll was in the hundreds of thousands, and that it devastated the civilian society, and it enriched and empowered the tyrant, and it compelled people to rely on him for survival. That we know.
So it actually had the opposite effect of what was intended.
Who said? Maybe what was usually, if you're in a court of law, you determine intent by predictable consequences. This was a completely predictable consequence. It was observed year after year, and it gives a plausible suggestion about intent. Not that, namely, that the U.S. didn't want the population overthrown. And in fact, we have further evidence for that, in fact, almost definitive evidence. After the first Gulf War, 1991, there was a major Shiite rebellion in the South, which probably would have overthrown Saddam. But the U.S. prevented it. The U.S. authorized Saddam to use military aircraft to crush it. He refused requests. The U.S. refused, Bush #1, refused requests from rebelling Iraqi generals just for access to captured Iraqi equipment, and laid the basis for Saddam's vicious crushing of a rebellion which might have overthrown him. Now that was explained, like in the New York Times. So the Middle East correspondent of the New York Times, Alan Cowell, said, well, ugly and unpleasant, but he said there's a consensus among U.S. and British leaders and their allies that Saddam Hussein is preferable for the stability of the region than those who are trying to overthrow him. Stability is a code word for our control. Thomas Friedman, then chief diplomatic correspondent, wrote that for the U.S., the best of all worlds would be an iron-fisted military junta in Iraq, running it just the way Saddam did. But since we can't get someone else, we'll have to settle for him. It wasn't secret. Well, does that indicate that the intention was to prevent the Iraqi people from overthrowing him on their own? Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can't prove it. We need some internal documents. It certainly can be inferred from plenty of evidence, including the predictable and predicted effects of the sanctions.
So from all this, that can be inferred, what you're also doing in terms of information, can the argument be made, as Ward Churchill is claiming, that the catalyst for the attacks on 9/11 could be largely devoted to the sanctions that the U.S. government did in Iraq in the 90s?
Well, if you take a look at the scholarship on Al-Qaeda, there's quite a lot of it by now, very good scholarship, by people like Michael Scheuer, who was the chief U.S. investigator, or independent scholars and others. One thing they all stress is that bin Laden's words and actions conform pretty closely. So he's telling us what he's planning to do, he's giving us the reasons, and they do it. Well, these are among the reasons. I mean, he has plenty of other reasons too. I mean, his main targets, I assume with them, with scholarship and U.S. intelligence, I see no reason to question them. But their conclusion is correct, that he's probably telling us pretty much what he thinks. But what he's telling us is that his main targets are the tyrannies in the Gulf that the U.S. is supporting. Like the Saudi Arabian monarchy is his main target. So it's so scared of him. He wants to establish his own version of radical Islam all over the Islamic world, and in their terms, to defend the Muslim world from outside aggression. And that's pretty much what they've done. So, for example, take the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. I mean, the jihadis went in there with U.S. support. I mean, U.S. basically created the jihadi movements in Afghanistan. They went in to drive the Russians out of a Muslim land. While they were fighting in Afghanistan, they were carrying out terrorist attacks inside Russia. They didn't report that much here, but it was happening. Serious, almost led to a Russian-Pakistan war. As soon as the Russians pulled out, they stopped attacking Russia from within Afghanistan. They still attack Russia from within Chechnya, but that's another Muslim land under attack. And it continues. Their words are pretty closely conform pretty closely to their deeds. So therefore I think U.S. intelligence and independent scholarship is probably pretty accurate in giving the reasons. Whether that's what Churchill said or not, I don't know. I read them.
Sure. I would like to bring around to the subjects of freedom of speech in academia. I'd actually like to get to also perhaps a Muslim issue in college campuses, but before I do that, I would like to bring up something that's been well known, is in your defense. In fact, this was shown in the movie Manufacturing Consent and then also written about by you quite extensively on, I believe in France, there was a scholar who you were defending for his Holocaust denial, and you made a point, of course, expressing a lot about probably people very much involved in free speech and committed to not on the basis of content, but on the principle of it. One thing I did notice about that was near the end of one of the interviews you had given, is you would disassociate. You felt it seemed necessary to disassociate from his beliefs. Something that I believe you said that it was repugnant, and of course you don't believe it's poppycock, something along those lines. Do you feel that, I believe at that time you felt that it was important enough to say, look, I don't associate with agree with you.
I had to say that because of the overwhelming Stalinist fascist character of Western intellectual life, which seems incapable of understanding of what Voltaire understood and what was a standard principle in the Enlightenment, that if you defend free speech, you defend it precisely for views that you find objectionable. I mean, Stalin and Goebbels were perfectly happy to defend speech that they approved of. If you're a defender of free speech, there's a criterion. You defend the speech of the views you find most objectionable. You can read that in the Supreme Court case Neer versus Minnesota, for example. That's the core of freedom of speech. Now, because Stalinist fascist doctrines are so deeply ingrained in intellectual life, it is actually necessary, unfortunately, to make the comments of the kind you mentioned. Incidentally, just to take your first sentence, I do not support Faurisson. I never did, and I never will. I supported his right to freedom of expression. I happen to oppose what was at stake in that was very straightforward. It was a Stalinist Nazi principle that the state shall have the right to determine historical truth and to punish deviation from it. As an anti-Nazi and an anti-Stalinist, I'm opposed to that. And that's exactly the issue that was at stake there. He was brought to court on the charges of falsification of history. And the state, through the courts, was going to determine whether he falsified history. That comes straight out of Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany.
Doesn't Canada also have similar law to that too, I believe?
Pardon?
Canada, yes.
Yes, the United States is one of the very few countries that has reached a reasonable standard of protection of freedom of speech. I've written this over and over. Canada has terrible standards. Britain has much worse standards. France has practically no standards at all.
The reason why I brought that up is because sometimes I think you felt the need, sometimes other people feel the need to disqualify themselves from the content, feel like they have to make a point of doing it because, like you mentioned, the backlash is so overwhelming.
It's not the backlash. It's because of the lack of comprehension among educated people of the most elementary principles of the Enlightenment. Given their lack of comprehension, it's necessary to explain these things to them. It's like if you have a 3-year-old who doesn't understand why he shouldn't run out into the street, you got to explain it to him. So if people literally cannot comprehend the concepts of freedom of speech that were developed during the Enlightenment, yes, then you have to explain them to them.
Do you think that problem in American society people need to have explained about Ward, I would say in this case, Ward Churchill? And why I bring that up is because it can be argued Ward Churchill himself has a very poor record on the issue of standing up for free speech and personal rights.
Criticizing for it. It's not got to do with anything.
Well, it probably might have to do something of many people do have claimed to support him, saying